We're just rotating here. You see one more time the earlier lectures today. We started out this morning with Yehuda Bauer, the Sacrament Center Distinguished Lecture at 11. And then that was followed up by the Michael and Elaine Jaffe lecture at 2 p.m. with a talk by Minas Afridi, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes. And we're now slowly arriving at our last of our distinguished lectures with Pieter Kohnstam and the Barnett lecture. But we'll give everyone just a tiny bit longer just to settle in before we get going. We also want to acknowledge again all the generous support that, as always, has allowed this program to go forward. And amongst them are various individuals who have generously given, but also obviously our biggest supporter, which is UTD. And we are really thrilled also again to we're also really thrilled to welcome today our provost, Dr. Inga Misselman, who's joining us tonight.
How much virus is going to come back?
I'm actually going to go ahead and hit mute all, Dr. Romer, and then you can just unmute yourself to continue talking.
That's so much better. So we, as I was saying, we're just showing the slides here to acknowledge really all the generous support that has allowed for us really to become now the permanent home for the annual Scholars Conference. As you will have realized this year, the conference doesn't quite take place in its normal format. And instead of a 3.5-day conference virtually, we decided rather to go with the invitation to 3 distinct speakers. And as it is customary, the Sunday evening lecture usually is chosen, in a way to have a wider appeal, not just to this, smaller circles of academics. And we like to always single out and find ourselves a very, very special individual. And we, which is not very easy, but this time around, it was always made easy for us because not too long ago, we organized one of our many programs. It was a program actually organized by Dr. Amy Kerner and Pedro Gonzalez and Sarah Valente on The Silent on Others, which was about Franco Spain and the silence over its victims. And that particular program attracted a man called Pieter Kohnstam. And ever since, we've become, shall we say, closer and closer with each other and quite good friends. And he has attended quite a few of our events. And it was therefore only natural that we would reach out to him. And we were very glad when he accepted our invitation. So therefore, let me now introduce our speaker. I'm not going to say a lot about him because the whole talk is actually about him, which will be a little bit in conversation with me. But I'm thrilled to introduce today Pieter Kohnstam, born in Amsterdam, like I said earlier, in 1936. He lives now in Florida. He is with the Anne Frank House in South Carolina. He's a published author with his memoirs and a passionate Holocaust educator. So I think, Peter, if that's okay with you, we are ready to go. Then, Peter, you have to unmute yourself. That's right.
You're unmuted. Okay.
Can I say a word?
Yes, of course.
Okay,
you can say many words now.
No. I don't want to take time away. I do want to thank you and the University of Texas at Dallas for organizing this. Excuse me? For organizing.
Just go on.
What is he saying?
I don't know, Peter. Just say what you
Go on, Peter.
Okay. For organizing this very important and timely lecture with all these other conferences. I do want to thank Mrs. Musselman for also making it possible for you and your department to give these lectures. I also want to thank Miriam Barnett for having sponsored this particular presentation of mine. And I thank them very, very much for their generosity. And now you're in charge.
All right, Peter. Then I think we are starting here with our first slide, and obviously with your memoirs, A Chance to Live, that appeared in both German, I think, in English and in Dutch. And it brings to the forefront really this a very unusual path that you had to navigate, and that is the very reason why you can be here today, from where it all began initially with your family in Germany and then onwards. So I think we want to like retrace some of these steps, and we have, for each one of those, we have a little bit of a slide that we're going to take as a way of guiding our conversation. And Cindy is the one who will move our slides along. So Cindy, if you don't mind, the next one. So this is a slide that right away brings a couple of images together, something private of a moment of individuals, a synagogue, different points in time, 1932. Peter, where are we here?
What?
Where are we? It's 1932.
Where are we? 1932?
Yes.
Do you see that picture?
The picture of 1932.
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm asking you.
The picture 1932 is when my parents got married in Bavaria. And
So this was in a small town called Fürth.
is what?
This was in Fürth, in a small town.
It was in Nuremberg. We got married.
It was in Nuremberg.
Nuremberg.
It was in Nuremberg.
I feel it's
And the photograph below is one of the, well, it is the synagogue where they got married, which, as one can see, is quite a substantial building, and is one of the 160, 70 ones or more that got destroyed during Kristallnacht, or the night of the broken crystal. Nothing remained of that building but a small stone remembrance that says, here stood the synagogue, blah, 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 blah.
Thank you. Cindy, I think if you just move on or hit it again, then there might be another picture that's coming in, 1938.
There's the photograph of one of the synagogues destroyed during November 1938.
And then this is what you just mentioned.
Right, and that is the stone and remembrance to where the synagogue stood with the names of rabbi and members of the board. And I think on top of it or next to it is a garage station.
All right, then.
Aha.
Now, however, yes. I think there's right away 2 more pictures underneath, Cindy, if you just get them as well, or one bigger one. Okay. Peter, now the world that, in which your parents got married in 1932 was very quickly, radically changed. And it was changed through these very occurrences that are captured in these pictures. You yourself, just to be clear, you were born in 36, so you don't directly have a memory of that, but this is what frames ultimately the escape of your family to Amsterdam, right?
Yes.
Correct, yes.
So when does your family leave?
My family had to flee, my father specifically, in 1933. And that was within the year of my parents' marriage. And they fled to Amsterdam. It was a very emotional meeting between him and his father, my grandfather. And do you want me to tell you how that happened? Or
Yeah,
not?
yeah. That's why you're here tonight.
Well,
tell
I
us.
don't want to encroach on the timing.
No, you go.
My father was an artist who felt he was, and he was a very talented painter, and he had gone to the Bauhaus in Dessau and had known quite a few people there, including Gropius and some of the painters, some already somewhat known and some coming up. Picasso was among them, Paul Klee. In the apartment of where my father lived, he didn't live with his family, he, with his wife, my mother, in the ground floor, he had a painting of a Saint Sebastian, and a member of the Nazi party or Gestapo walked by, and as you know, curtains were always drawn and people could look into the apartment, so they saw the painting. The next thing that happened is my grandfather got a call that his son was accused of a degenerate painter. And so the painting was accused of being degenerate, as so many other artwork and books, etc., that were taken over as being accused of being degenerate. So the chief of police had made a call and told my grandfather, and they were friends, he better leave because he was going to be apprehended and sent to concentration camp. So that then produced a very emotional meeting, and my father then was asked to leave by his father to Amsterdam. Why Amsterdam and the Netherlands? It was a neutral country. Many people had left their countries, also mostly from the Eastern European countries, to hopefully, they were hoping that maybe a future war wouldn't happen. So they were weighing out time. And in addition, the family had a business, a warehouse, an office, so my father could work. And a few days later, my mother joined, and so that is how it became that we went to Amsterdam.
Thank you. Cindy, can you hit one more time? I think there are, yes. So here in between, though, we see the radically changing circumstances. This is still leading up to Hitler coming to power, where now on the one side, the lower one, it's the Jews are identified with Marxism and with communism and seen as an evil, and then you see the marking on businesses and other posters here. So this is, you know, the quickly changing circumstances of Jewish life in Germany that are virtually make it impossible for Jews to live, and therefore many Jews very quickly leave in 33 if they can. Peter, you want to say anything more about these?
Well, no, I think you said it, and I'm not going to add anything.
Then we'll move to the next one.
Yes.
And this is something where I think you're going to speak a little bit more.
Okay. As you can read the slide, it's Mercator Plain. In the bottom red square is where my parents, after several moves in Amsterdam, rented the apartment there. The other one that is a little bit 2 doors away on the second floor is where the Otto Frank family used to live. It was a very nice street because, as you can see, it ended in sort of a funnel with what we call the skyscraper, which is still standing and still exists, and is still the people living there, and we know a family there. And so by chance, we lived 2 doors away from the Frank family, and my mother was a very vivacious and gregarious person, and knew 11 languages fluently, including Latin. So she made very friends, and she and Edith Frank became good friends, and the Otto Frank and us, my parents, especially during curfew hours from 1939-40 to until we fled in 42, played bridge every night or every second night. And my mother then hit it off with Annie. And Annie was also vivacious, gracious, a little prankish girl, growing in her, as a young teenager. She was 12, 13 at some point then. And naturally, we know that she was a writer, but she was interested in and high heels, movie stars, and movies, and all kind of stuff. The scooter that you see in the park, which is not exactly the same scooter I had, my father, the family had been in the toy merchandising business. It was a very well-known company in the toy industry, still is, by the way, today. And one day I got a scooter, and it was a beautiful scooter with big wheels, etc., etc. And Anne had to try it immediately, sat me in the front of the scooter. We went to the park, and a bad maneuver, and we both fell on the ground, which had gravel. And I slit my chin open, and big commotion and blood and this and that. And this was 1930, I would guess 1938 or something like that, 1939, 8. And we just couldn't go to any hospital, and etc. It was difficult for Jewish people to do that for various reasons that we will discuss in a little bit. So everything was taken care of. My grandmother came out, took us to a doctor, I think in the neighborhood, who sewed me up. And well, I got a souvenir on my chin. That's the result of that one. Next.
All right, thank you. All right.
Okay, this is on the top, actually, the Otto Frank family with Otto and Anne in the front, Margot in the back, and Edith on the side. On the bottom is my father, and then actually my grandmother, maternal grandmother, and myself. It's interesting to note that if you look at Otto Frank and how they were dressed, and how my family was dressed and my father, there was a certain culture in those days of dress codes and how you dressed and etc., etc. Jeans and all of that was not known, and so people dressed very well, and I will address that a little bit later when we see some photographs that where that is. I'm going to make a comment about it. Okay. Welcome to Anne Frank, and the picture on the right is known, and she's possibly looking down to our backyard garden, but we cannot verify that, but that seems to be the case. Next. That's the garden in the back, and the first picture on the top and on the left, that is where I played when it was warm, and my parents had a wash tin basin, then filled with water, where I would splash around and etc. And naturally, Anna would come. She was in our apartment almost daily, really. And the alley is an alley that is in the back of our garden. And that is where my father then fled. When we fled, my mother and I, well, we fled, all three of us. And he fled through that alley. And my mother and I fled in a different way. So that's what that reminds us of. At some point, Edith Frank complained to my mother, who during the good times, before the occupation, my mother had been a pioneer kindergarten teacher with Montessori. Now, what I didn't know until I checked not too long ago, is Montessori was involved with the Netherlands a few times and died in the Netherlands. I wouldn't be surprised my mother knew of Montessori. And one of the friends we have in that skyscraper is still today working as a teacher or principal with Montessori. So Edith complained to my mother that Annie was leaving papers around her apartment. And well, as we know, some people of German descent are very genau, and everything had to be clean, neat, and proper. So she was complaining that she was leaving the papers all over the place. So Anna would come to our apartment almost daily and write on this, and we knew where the papers were and this and that. She did a little clowning, and I had to be the audience. Thank you. And so my mother told Edith, why don't you consider buying her diary? Okay, that little light bulb. And for her 13th birthday, bingo, it happened. So we can state as a fact that if it wouldn't have been for my mother, there wouldn't have been a diary of Anne Frank. The next picture is, okay. Cindy, can you come back? Well, that's okay. You can go to the next picture. That's fine. You can see the memories. And as I indicated previously, she was interested in movies and movie stars, some that sang, some a little bit more romantic in those days of movie stars. And she had the pictures on the wall. And then you have a few pages in her own handwriting. And so that's that. Okay.
Now everything is changing though, right?
Now
life begins to change.
Yes, now things are changing very drastically. And I promised Niels I'm not going into history, which I will not, but Hitler became prime minister in 1933. And for us, the Jewish people in Central Europe and other areas, well, not the other areas from us, Austria and Germany, the Netherlands, maybe Belgium, started to become a big problem. And at some point, naturally after the Wannsee conference in 1940 or 42, which declared the demise of the Jewish Nazis, etc., somebody came up with the idea of the Yellow Star of David. Now, each country occupied by the Germans had the word Jew in the middle of it. That one is in Dutch, and I happen to have a Star of David that Susan doesn't let me show because I think it's too dramatic. The pictures that you're seeing, 1, 2, 3, except the bottom right, I will talk a little different, shows the occupation and marching in into some towns, including Amsterdam. And you can see quite a few people on the right top waving in the Nazi salute, and soldiers responding to that. The one on the right bottom, we had gradually, especially after 1938 and 39, razzias. And that meant that the Nazis and Gestapo and military would not only apprehend people on the streets, whoever it was, whenever, but it will also unannouncedly come and invade apartments and where one lived. So what you see there on that particular picture is a little convoy, a mechanized convoy, which started with a motorbike with a sidecar, one of the lower echelon Nazis, a sergeant or whoever, and a truck. In that case, it's not a truck. If you look well, it's a mechanized equipment with other soldiers. And then naturally on the back is the car with the captain or whoever. The way we would know they were coming is because they would have their sirens blowing at full speed. And naturally, we were very afraid and very concerned. who was next. In one case, they came to our neighbor's apartment exactly next door. My mother was a good friend with a grandmother in that house, 8 people and a young girl. They apprehended all the goods and put signs that now the furniture and the paintings, etc., was all part of the Germans. And came back 2 days later and machine gunned out everybody except this one girl. And it so happens that somebody who lives in our apartment now, who is a historian who used to work for Anne Frank, wrote a book, Merville Plain, and found out that that young girl, who was 14, 15, was alive 3 years ago, living in Scotland, 96 years old, and stated that, yeah, that she remembered me and that little cute boy and blonde hair and blah, 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 and what happened and so on. So that gave some verification to my story. A few days later, they came to our apartment. And I will tell more about that later.
Yeah, I think Cindy, yes. So can you speak a little bit more about that map, that the map and the list?
Yes, well, the list verifies or states the name of Jewish residents on Merville Plain. And Susan marked with red the Franks and the Kohnstams. The map on the lower right is a map that we got at the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam when we were writing my book and getting materials. And maybe you want to tell the story? No. We were shown that map, which they happen to have on the wall, that shows the concentration of where Jewish people lived in central South Amsterdam. The comment that the researcher gave to Susan was really very cute. He said, I wish we would have done more, or not, what? Not
been so accurate.
That we would not have been so accurate for the Germans. So that was his comment a few years ago. That's it.
Cindy,
that one. Now,
this is the one we were waiting for.
okay,
Sure.
well, this is a picture. Yeah, I'm being redundant. And we have not decided, thank you, Cindy, for showing, that is me, or the one I was showing you yesterday, Cindy, here on the right, more on the top. But I did recognize the teacher, but I don't remember the name. So you can see the handmade Stars of David. And Susan, you want to say something? No. So these were kids that could no longer go to the public schools and so on, and went to this private school or something. So that's what that means. That is very interesting. Well, it was the orders or the call-up notice by the Nazis ordering the Dutch. So I cannot show the title, the address on the oproepening, which is the Dutch version of this order, which has a number on the right side, which is a Jewish organization that was following orders of the Nazis. And what it says is what we could take to that station that we were ordered to go to in Amsterdam. It was not a main station. And that is what we could take. 1 pair of boots, 1 work suit, 2 sheets. I don't know where we could take 2 sheets, 1 mug, a spoon, 1 pullover, and 2 socks, a pair, and 1 or 2 underpants, and so on and so forth. And that was at the railroad station from where we found out sometime later that 1,500 people had been ordered on that day in June of 1942, go to the railroad station at midnight. So nobody could see what they were doing during the day. From there to, yes, I'm sorry.
No, Peter. So it's really at this point then where the Franks are making one critical decision, that is to go into hiding, and your family makes an altogether different decision.
Okay,
So
well, that's a good point. That's a good point. When we got this letter, these orders, my family, composed of my mother, my father, my maternal grandmother, and a doctor in the neighborhood. I see his face and I cannot remember his name. And the Franks had to decide what we were going to do. And we were not together separately, but this was decision time. And to make it short, in our case, well, Otto Frank had invited my father and family to hide with them in an annex that he said he was preparing to use in case of need. At that time, when he said that, during playing bridge with my parents, nobody in the world knew that he was having or preparing an annex to hide in. For several reasons, my mother decided with my grandmother, I guess, that that was not a good case because my mother had already decided to divorce my father one day. They were going to come out alive of this ordeal, which took another year. And I was a little gregarious, etc. Nobody knew how long we would be hiding and cooped up in an apartment with other people. So at our meeting, it was decided, it was quite an emotional meeting, naturally. My father didn't want to leave Germany, which was not unusual from other German people. And my grandmother wasn't going to leave because my grandfather, maternal grandfather, her first husband, had been an officer killed in the First World War in Lille, France. So she thought nobody would touch her when they came to our apartment. So the decision was made. The doctor and my grandmother had an idea. They said, listen, if you're going to stay, you have no chance. I mean, this is concentration camp. But if you live, if you escape, you have a chance to live. Years later, when I was writing the book, that became the title of the book, which my grandmother said, and Susan remembered it and said, why don't we title it A Chance to Live? The doctor committed suicide 48 hours later because he wasn't going to be transported to concentration camp. And my father stated very clearly that once we were in Westerbork, which was a gathering prison camp.
Transit camp.
Exactly. A week or so later, there were weekly transports to both Theresienstadt and Auschwitz of about 650 to 700 in freight cars that you will see in a little while when Cindy gets there. We were supposed to be transported to Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. So that's what he said. So that was it. So that's the story of this. Now, once that happened, what do you do? Well, you see Gerda Leske on the top left at a time when she was an attractive young lady, and she and her husband were Christian Germans who were extremely helpful to my parents. And I remember them coming during curfew times for 2 years every Sunday and bringing us the goodies for breakfast or brunch, all the fishes and the this and the that. I'm sure Niels remember that too from Europe, and toys, really. put our lives in great, great danger because the streets were all occupied and being looked by military and secret service of the Nazis, etc., etc. So the first thing my mother thought was, okay, I'm going to call Gerda. Now, once the situation became such that Jewish people couldn't work anymore and earn a living, my mother liked and was quite attractive, I would say, but interested in fashion, cosmetics, and a lot of other things, which is something that also attracted Anne Frank to her. And they own two dress stores, one in Amsterdam and one in Maastricht, which is about 2 hours south of Amsterdam on the Belgian border. The first thing she said is, come to our store as quickly as you can, and we'll organize something. And that is what Gerda did. Do you want me to tell you what she organized?
Yes, of course.
Okay. My father had been an artist, as I indicated, and my mother was already earning money under the table from the Leskes, who owned two dress stores, in Maastricht and Amsterdam, and was modeling and etc. My father was not designing for them. He was doing his own thing under the table with all kind of connections in Amsterdam, some Jewish and some not, by the way. The first thing we did, my father naturally, when you saw that alley in the back, escaped from there, but had to be very careful because by now the streets that connected to the alley, there was a fairly large main not highway, street. It wasn't a big highway, but you know, that is where the trams used to go and this and that. So he had to be careful. And my mother took me in the tram, the still white and blue, which I remembered from my youth. And she used to take me when I was a little bit of a pain and to calm me down and take me around the city, etc. So, and we were told to go into the store in the back, from the back, so nobody would see us. And we did. So the first thing that had to happen was to remove the Star of David, which had left a mark on the outside coat. So we changed the coats, we took the stars, I don't know what happened to them, and we got new coats. The idea that she proposed was she was going to, she offered herself, to have a mock fashion show in her store in Maastricht. Take us in the train with other public workers and soldiers going, which is what we did. And my mother was supposed to, she was going to have a fashion show, a mock fashion show. My mother was supposed to be the model on modeling. My father, the artist, was to design the dresses. And I was not allowed, this is the first big, the second big experience, so to speak, that I had to do something that was completely contrary to what I had grown up with, which was not recognize my parents, but make believe that Gerda was my mother during that railroad ride. And my father falsified the papers, which were good enough after we were stopped several times and passed the inspection after big sweats and etc. And there were some experiences in the railroad car. My parents and Gerda and I sat in different seats. Naturally, I wasn't allowed to recognize my parents or anything. And at some point I did make eye contact and my mother looked aside and whatever. It caused some kind of a What?
Constellation.
Consternation?
Constellation.
A what?
I don't-
Yeah, it made me feel very concerned, and Gerda naturally realized that, hugged me, put me against the chest, and things calmed down. And we did get to Maastricht safe. In the meantime, her husband had said goodbye to my father in the railroad station. And while he shook hands, had some papers that he put in my father's hand. And those were the tickets for the railroad car, and winked his eyes saying, they're okay. So that's what he meant. So that is how we got to Maastricht.
But Peter, how then from Maastricht onward? You have a second map there. There's still a long way to go from there to get all the way to Barcelona during those days. We're like in 1942, that's all of France. Would you mind like telling us a little bit more about this in particular? Cindy, can you move to the next slide? Then we start to see again that France was also sharply divided into two zones and was not particularly open for easy access. So how did you manage to get across France and to get into Spain?
Well, the first cross was from Maastricht to Belgium, which was not far from Verviers, which is quite a nice place in peace times. This was at night, and naturally what we had to do in all of the border crossings was to make connections with the resistance or underground. It was pay cash in advance. You never knew if they were going to be at the agreed upon place or the agreed upon time. Most of the time we were lucky, because many times these people who were opportunists and cheaters, they would steal the money, the little bit they had, or some people may not have had so little, I don't know, and jewelry, naturally, and would take it and just kill them. So we were taking across the border and overnighted in a shack, really, that I remember we visited in the 60s, believe it or not, that still existed right there, which was composed of a bar where they had some ladies of the night that was organized by the underground and people who were cooperating with the Allies in Belgium. And we had to take off our shoes. And while they were singing and being inebriated by these ladies downstairs, we were taken upstairs on creaky steps. So we had to be very careful, as I said, without shoes, not to make noise, and put in a room. That room was for 3 people with no bathroom any place, and there was a little sink, and that became the toilet. It so happened, it was a smelly room, it stunk, and it was dark. But my father lit with something, and we could see swatches of what turned out to be blood spots on the walls and on the bed. And what it turned out to be was a torture room. So we couldn't go to the store and change our clothes the next day. So had what we wore, and we used it for a long, long time. If it was wet, it was wet. If it was dirty, it was dirty. There was no place to dry or hang up your clothes or wash the clothes when we were fleeing. Mostly by foot, mostly in unannounced highways, mostly dressed like farmers, and well, always dressed like farmers, and except in some of the cities where then we could maybe wash and change clothes, which my mother made with old sewing machines if they were in existence in these inns or farmhouses, using bed sheets or curtains. So, and for the longest time, I didn't wear shoes. I wore the wooden blocks, like the Dutch did in the farms. So, until Spain, really. So that was,
Peter,
yes.
Peter, get us now back to France and your way into Spain, please.
Well, from Belgium, we went to, in part via train, working train, to not Brussels, what's it called? The other town in Belgium.
Brugge.
Huh?
Go to Spain.
I forget.
Brugge? Okay.
Well,
Go on.
Anvers, I think it is.
Ah, okay.
So, and then passed some hours hiding and a breath of air, whatever. And from then, planning what we were going to do next. I mean, there was no plan of action. There was no how we're going to do things. It was that circumstances run and motivated what we were going to be doing. So from there, we stayed, I think, a day or a day and a half, and through new connections went through Lille, where we hid, where my mother visited her father's grave, and there was another story, and I don't know, we have enough time to go through that in the German World War I cemetery. And she had never met her father. And that was the only and one time that she reconnected. And in fact, I didn't mention that when my father fled, was forced to flee Germany, he never saw his father again. His father died a year later, and that was, he couldn't go to the funeral. A, he wasn't there. B, if he would have gone, he would have been imprisoned, sent to concentration camp. So it was a big goodbye in 1933. At that time, my father didn't know that. So anyway, so from Lille with train and by foot, we wound up in Paris. And we always had places that were discussed either between my parents and or with or not the resistance were to meet. And as I said earlier, we always went separately. We never went together. So my father and I and my mother. So after lots of other tribulations and danger, we made it to Paris from Anvers, Antwerp. Now the name came to me. So, and we stayed there, and we eventually, shall I tell you what we said? No. And eventually we left. There was an incident in the railroad car. My father was apprehended, but released after 4 hours. And we were already in the place that we had agreed to meet. So the trip, so to speak, from Maastricht to Barcelona, which is approximately 1,100 miles, took just about 11 months, and 85% was by foot. So that's about it.
Thank you, Peter. Cindy, can you get us to the next one? Peter, do you want to say something about this outhouse in France?
Sure. The first experience I had was when our apartment in Amsterdam was invaded by the Nazis and took everything away. And as I was standing there with my grandmother in front of my parents, I felt my mother slid something in my hand. Now you have to understand these people were hitting us with the butts of their guns and knocking on every piece of furniture and the walls, yelling and shouting insults and so on. And so it was a very dangerous, unpleasant kind of situation. And we were terrorized, but we had been terrorized before, so it was all a gradual process until it got to that in a period of 3 years or 4 years. When I somehow, by osmosis, put that little piece of paper in my mouth and then without making any signs of anything, swallowed it. And that was it. And when they left, I asked my grandmother, I said, you know, I swallowed that paper, what will happen? She said, Peter, don't worry, it'll all come out. It did. And what that paper had was the address of Gerda Leske and her husband and other people. If they would have seen that, they would have been all apprehended and sent to concentration camp. So I do want to also say that about 7 years ago, we were able to, what's the Yad Vashem certificate for Gerda Leske?
Righteous Gentile.
We were able, Susan and I, to have Yad Vashem grant Gerda Leske the
Righteous Gentile.
the certificate of righteous Gentile for the heroism that they accomplished for us. Okay, now we are in France.
Yes.
Hold a minute, go back, Cindy. I'll tell you about the outhouse. So so we already had 2 incidences. We had our apartment with the paper. We had the train to Maastricht, and now we are in central France. You saw the photograph, the picture of the 2 Frances. It was still La France Libre, which is free France and occupied France. And the Cher River was the mythological border between North and South. So the secret was, and the goal, if one could reach the Cher River, that was very, very good. But then you have to cross it. So we did. And okay, after many stories and danger and this and that, we are now in the center of France. And I was going to school with French kids. And somehow the soldiers came around and started persecuting us and bullying us. And what I wanted to do is find out if we could tell them the secrets of who we were, where we were going, and what we were doing there. So I ran when I saw that. And we were living in a farmhouse that somebody had very generously lent to us, a real farmhouse, a small stone farmhouse with hay roof. And the next thing I know, I saw this outhouse, which was our bathroom. And that was, I don't know, 20, 30 feet from the farmhouse. And went right into the hole where people did their thing and hid under where you sit. There were 2 boards, served as seat, and hid there against the wall of the hole in the ground for about 20, 25 or 30 minutes. And yeah, the Germans came and did their thing, but they didn't see me, and I was under the feces at that moment. And that's it. So my mother came running. She had heard there was a problem, and my father was axing wood around the house outside for the fireplace, which was also it was an oven and a stove and a fireplace, all 3 things at the same time. So I disappeared. Well, the next thing was, where was Peter? The soldiers left, did their thing, left. Well, I somehow got myself out of that, naturally all messed up. And there was one of the old fire pumps between the house and the farmhouse and the outhouse. And the water was, I still remember, freezing cold. So they pumped the water and washed me down, took my clothes in a hay fork and put them in a big pot that was with boiling water in the farmhouse. And I had to, they wound me up in some towels or bedsheets, I don't know what. And I went into the down bed for about 3 hours to warm up again. So that was the experience of the outhouse. Okay,
Right.
now this is
South of France.
Pardon?
The south of France. So
Right.
we still have
Okay.
to get you over the border here.
Right. So I'm going to be as quick as I can. When you see the triangle on the top where the red and blue lines meet, we were supposed to be on a train going to Perpignan, which was on the border with Spain on the Mediterranean. Now, that was a decision taken after we had to flee from where we were, because the Germans now, who had invaded all of France, were following Jews and other people escaping and killing them. In our case, where we stayed in the inn, at that point, we were not in the farmhouse, and we knew there was a high, there was no way of mixing them up. They were always in dark suits with black hats and etc. Absolute no sense of humor or anything else. And he was part of the Vichy government. He was fined, murdered, not too far from where we were staying by the underground. He had been a general in the Vichy government. In any event, there we are in Villeneuve-sur-Loire. And we are in a train. And as it happened, the Germans decided, as they did most of the time, often, to change the routing of the train. And it stopped at some place in Ars-sur-Adour, which is mentioned, a small town there, and jockeying cars back and forth and this and that. And after a while, half an hour or so, the train continued. Nobody knew where we were going or what was going on. And eventually it stopped at a railroad station. Wet, muddy, with still snows visible from the Pyrenees, with the Gestapo and other Secret Service in our car, checking people, etc., etc. Suddenly, my head was against the glass pane of the window of the railroad car, and we saw people marching, or being forced to walk, not marching, away. And they were all properly dressed, and you will see in a minute or two the picture that I'm thinking about. My father goes around, and to his complete dismay, he froze, as did my mother, who was in another car. The name Gurs. Well, Gurs became another gathering way station with a concentration camp with 30,000 people who had finally made it across Europe to the Pyrenees, were sent back to Germany from Gurs. Now just think about that. So here we were in Gurs, falsified papers and etc., etc., etc. But nothing happened to us. Eventually, after these people were marched off, the train continued south on the border with the Pyrenees to Perpignan. That's it. That was that story.
Cindy, yes.
Cindy, is there a photograph that I like to show where people were walking with the railroad station and the freight car?
No, sir, that one got pulled out of this when we were going through it.
Oh, you got
In the
out of it.
interest of time.
Oh, okay. What I wanted to say is that we never walked where other people were fleeing, meaning Jews as well as non-Jews, but most of them would have been Jewish people, on the main highways. As I said earlier, we were dressed as farmers. My mother was perfect in French, in all the dialects. My father wasn't allowed to talk because his two languages, English and German, would have heavily German accented, so people would have known immediately where we were coming from. But people were dressed. People were dressed like going to synagogue or going to work. Black hat. The women still with veils, the hats, as some of you may have seen in the past. Semi-high heels, shine shoes, men with starched collars and ties like Niels would remember, and bales and suitcases that were bulky and ties and ends of ties and belts popping out of the seams of the suitcases, some with bales, cartons, bags, or even carts. So we never went with them because those are people that we generally apprehended and machine gunned down right there. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Thank you, Peter. But
next
therefore
thing
you made it across the border.
Right, we are now in Perpignan for 2 weeks. And how my mother got to know and meet underground, we shall never know. But she did. And made a connection with somebody who was part of the Spanish and Turkish Railroad Union, which encompassed the French, and came out with a plan that was completely crazy and daring. And it was that, first of all, my father and I were going to be together again, and my mother separately, disguised as railroad workers, and we had to smush our faces and hands with shoe polish, etc. The underground gave us the clothes that had to be smudged too. And there was a tunnel. Well, the decision was really, we were going to walk across the Pyrenees to Spain, which was almost an impossibility. My father was not a sporty person, and even if he would have been, the fairly high mountains and eternal snow, cold. There were partisans still from the remains of the Spanish Civil War, and others who were just interested in your money or jewels, and steal them and kill you and throw you down the embankments of the mountains. Or go to Andorra. Well, neither of these three plans really motivated or enticed my parents very much. And I have to tell you that up to then, nobody knew where we were going to go, if we were going to reach that stage of our flight, and what we were going to do. My father was still not ready to leave Germany, never mind Europe. And my grandmother had already been left behind, and that's a complete different story for another time. She was hidden for 3 years by Christian people in Amsterdam. Different people, all different people. So here we are, and I remember that one night, making believe I was asleep, listening to my parents with people of the underground, planning how they were going to do this. There was a tunnel that the trains took between the two countries, 1.5 miles or 2 miles long. So the union workers were going to plan to have a train unscheduled, not known on the schedules, to run at the same speed parallelly of the public train bringing back workers and soldiers from France to Port Beau in Spain. But we had to jump from one train to another. My mother would go 1 or 2 days later, disguised as a young man, stoker of the locomotive engineer. So, shall I go on?
Yes, please.
In order to accomplish this, eventually, and I'm sorry, we went to that railroad station and we're supposed to meet the underground who didn't come, and we didn't know what happened because nothing was ever sure. And we had people fleeing with us who got murdered by underground people who stole their little belongings they may have had. In one case, hidden in the handle of a suitcase. So, so my father didn't know the language. Underwood trains making noise and smoke, and there were no electric trains or anything. These were all locomotives, jockeying cars back and forth. And I was lying on the trucks for about a good half an hour. And I tell you, I still remember each instant. So I peed in my pants. It was freezing cold. I mean, we were on the hills on the bottom of the Pyrenees, waiting for that man to come. Well, eventually, somebody singing or whistling the ta 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 ta. That was the secret code of underground, which had been a rhyme song, still is a rhyme song of children which came from the soldiers in the wars of the 1700s. Auprès de ma blonde, longing for the blonde lady, my wife or girlfriend. And he came whistling, reading a paper. That got me out of the bottom of the train, which hadn't moved yet, that particular railroad car, and got us in a freight car. And now they see, and one of the engineers came, must have known we were in there, locked the door and left it a little bit ajar. And that was a wise move. But now we didn't know where the train was going to go. I sort of fell asleep. My father had hugged me, so I was warm and good. I don't think he slept at all. And eventually, an hour, 2 hours later, we hear a swishy sound, and in between the cracks of the wooden panels of the railroad, we saw water. And we smiled. So we knew we were going south alongside the Mediterranean. If it wouldn't have been water, we would have gone north with no water, then we would have been in trouble. And so eventually, with the underground helping us, I had to jump. Well, I didn't have to jump. They threw me across the two trains. My father had a problem. He got caught between the two trains, but thanks God nothing happened. So they pulled him up and pushed him on the freight car going to Barcelona. And so we were in the car. Now across the border, the Germans stopped the train and tried to open the door, and thanks God, this engineer had locked the door so he couldn't open it. And if anybody wants to say that we were scared or not, well, that's the misdemeanor of this entire thing. But we eventually made it to Barcelona. Pitch black in the middle of a sunny day at 9 o'clock, after we had run across the railroad yard before the train went into the railroad station of Barcelona. And we wanted to know where we were. They were all smiling, having their tea at 6 o'clock in the morning. And then we realized we were pitch black. Why? Because that car had been a cold car the day before. So we were dirty with soot and naturally didn't have any clothes to change. So about being demeaned. My mother was apprehended 2 days later, in spite of the fact that she had to cut her hair and put something around her breast so they wouldn't see that she was a woman. But they found out she was a woman and was put in a prison camp in Spain, Figueres, for almost 3 months. So we lost contact with her for a long time. And that entire period of what she went through and what we went through, I can stay here for another 3 hours and tell you the disaster and terrible things that happen on both ways, et cetera, but I don't have the time to do that. So here we are in Barcelona, trying to get to know where my mother was and making, reconnecting, et cetera, because she was not only across the Cher, she eventually worked for the French resistance for a while, which my father didn't know. And she got herself out of this terrible women's prison in Figueres because she knew English, et cetera, with a secret message for the Allies that her roommate had given her that was important for D-Day. So I just thought I'll pitch that in, and Niels, it's yours.
Yes, so I think time is moving along, so I'm afraid that we're gonna have to rush it now a little bit. If you don't mind just telling us how you eventually ended up on that ship that brought you all out of
Okay, I'll do it
Spain
quickly. I'll promise, do it quickly. We are in Amsterdam. Yes, eventually we reconnected with my mother. I just said that, but that's another story. One day it's in a marketplace or something, and somehow a man comes to him, introduces him as Klein, K-L-E-I-N, which I believe must have been Hayes or somebody like this. They were speaking, I think, in German, got touched by the story, introduced him to the chief of police, who was so taken that he immediately from his office called the bishop, who was new, or fairly new in those days, to make an appointment, which we got an audience with. By then, my mother was already with us. And okay, so I'm not going to go into details of anything. We have a meeting, and after 3 hours, the bishop agreed to give us the documents that Argentina had required by law, which were that people immigrating needed original certificates of baptism by the church. And my parents had made it clear they weren't going to do that to the bishop. And as I said, after 3 hours and etc., it was also an emotional meeting. We got the documents. It then went back to the police chief, who had some connection actually with the shipping line, which still exists under a different name. And I contacted the owners when I was writing the book of Ibarra, Y-B-E-R-R-A. And we have the copy of the ship, there it is. And we're embarked on steerage with, I don't know, 2 or 3 other couples. My mother had a different cabin with somebody. And the sailing was supposed to be, under normal circumstances, 21 days. It took 72 to 74 days, and there's the map. So why did it take that long? Because the ship was involved with the German Navy in supplying the packs of U-boats in the North Atlantic, changing course at night or so on, and throwing barrels of supplies into the ocean, including petroleum and etc. And that is why it took so long. So when we got to Trinidad, Tobago, my father was told that the ship was in fact on the eyes of the British to be sunk. Now it was a freighter, and it had about, I called it the ship of fools, for those of you who know the movie, because it was a combination of spies and some very famous Spanish actors and actresses and others. And I have quite a few memories from the ship and so on. And so eventually we made it to Argentina in June of '3, which was really 1 year after we had started our walk from Amsterdam.
All right, Peter, I think then we want to give everyone also a chance to possibly ask you some questions, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So if you want to type out your questions in the chat, then I'll pick them up and quickly we'll ask those questions. So if you just want to get going in the... Susan, you want to say hello to everyone? We heard you always in the background.
There she is.
Why don't you come into the picture and say hello?
Hello.
Say hello to your brother.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, he's
Good.
Thank you. Peter, I rushed you a little bit at the end, but
That's fine.
You like sometimes also to speak about your experience in relationship to that of other refugees today. Would you mind, maybe talking a little bit about that?
The relationship with other refugees, you mean
Well,
immigrant? You mean immigrant?
Yeah, yes. You
Okay.
have.
It is a point that Susan has brought up a few years ago. Why am I different from other immigrants? Actually, I'm not very different from other immigrants. And as we know, the Holocaust exists today in other countries, in Africa, for example, possibly in the Middle East. So it is where I feel I have a connection with them. I know what they're going through. I know what they have to do, even in our own borders. There is no hygiene, there's no this, there's no that. They have to walk for many miles or kilometers, etc., etc. It's a terrible situation that nobody can understand what it does to the people, and especially to the young people. I mean, these kids will never forget what these experiences were.
Thank you, Peter. We have another question. When did you leave Buenos Aires?
When?
Yes.
Why?
When?
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 I left alone with my ambitions were in inverse proportion to the money I had in my pocket, and came through Miami. 1963, in the June, July of 63. And the airline went broke, and the owner was a Jew living in Coral Gables, and he bought me dinner and never gave me the money of the airline that went broke. So that is how I started my trip.
Let me follow up with another question from Pia. There's this, first of all, she, like many others, thank you for your wonderful presentation, but she asked really, how did you build your life, or how did your family build your life after all of that? And maybe you can use this also as an opportunity to talk a little bit about your involvement with the Anne Frank House, because the second question is then, how do we help others to overcome such experiences and such trauma? And so what I didn't really have a chance to say earlier, that I think you started many years ago to talk about your experience. You wrote your book and you lecture these days very widely, Zooming, Skyping, and then you have a dedicated website where one can learn about your experience. So can you say something more about how is it important for you to talk about your experience today?
I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 experiences in my family and put it all in, wrap it up a little. We don't have to forget that my parents had to flee Germany in 1933 the first time. They came to the Netherlands. They were young people, I would think in their late 20s, maybe early 30s. So here they are and had to start again in the Netherlands. I came later, and I think that what permeates how we do this is Jewish people were forced to flee for 5,780 years. And people have asked me often, what is it that you're still in existence and keeps you going? And I think that one of the things is tenacity, hope, never lose hope, family and education, and hard work. And I think that that is what has helped us to stay together. I just saw an hour ago somebody in your program who was speaking about merchandising in the Middle Ages. I just finished a book about that. Mm-hmm. It is very interesting theme. So we were not always allowed to do what we wanted to do. So we had to do what nobody wanted to do. That is how we became money lenders. Then we went into banking. In America, later on, cosmetic industry, the movie industry, not to talk about musicians, composers, and that is a different story. So it is that tenacity and hope to get out and move forward. That's what Anne Frank had. The hope that people will eventually at the bottom be better than what she was seeing, and that we would one day prosper and do for others, so they don't have to suffer what we suffered.
Thank you, Peter. Let me just maybe then ask you one other question. You mentioned early on your father, that he was an artist and very productive in many ways, but then he indeed returned to Germany eventually. Excuse me? Your father returned to Germany?
Yes, yes.
Can you
in the early 60s. And then, he never, by the way, as a matter, sorry for interrupting you. No. He never wanted to drive the 100 kilometers from Munich to Nuremberg. He never went back to visit Nuremberg and Fürth, by the way, where I don't know if he knew that the properties of our ancestors, his family, was still in existence at that time. He absolutely didn't want to go back.
So he does return to Germany, but never again to his hometown.
Correct. And I think it was because of pension.
Mhm. All right, then I would think that this is a time where everyone can unmute themselves, they can clap, they can shout, they can cheer, they can, express in any shape or form they want their appreciation. Thank you so much, Peter. This was very, very special for all of us. I know this Zooming is not always the easiest way of doing this, but I think this will have worked really well for everyone, and we cannot wait to invite you next time to campus and to meet us and to introduce you really to all of our wonderful friends and to our students. But in the meantime, I want to thank again everyone for having gone through our slightly altered annual Scholars Conference. And now let's thank our wonderful distinguished speaker.
Thank
and
you.
Also let's thank Susan. I think Susan has also deserves a big clap and thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, it does.
Got it. Clap.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I thank you all for naturally attending. This wouldn't be important if the university wouldn't have stages with the Barnett family, but thanks to I see Mr. Richard Leibowitz, and
Yes.
far away, I think of Mr. Krugman. If I look quickly, he looks like Paul Krugman.
I think he takes it as a compliment. He's laughing.
Absolutely.
You better, you better.
Absolutely.
Where is he?
Thank you. Let's do it again.
Absolutely. So then I'll just say goodbye to everyone and hope to see you soon again.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Bye bye.
Bye, Mimi. I see you and Mitch in the background.
Bye, Mimi.
I'm gonna log off.
Thank you all.
Peter, we will be in touch. Right?
Absolutely. Very important.
Absolutely. What did you say, Wednesday or Thursday? Like toward the end of this week, we'll hear from you, right?
You haven't forgotten.
No, I don't forget.
Okay. I said what I said. I hope to God I will be back to you.
Absolutely. So, goodbye again, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good night. Bye, Peter.
Robert.
Bye, Susan.
Bye. Good night, everyone.